G'day folks, and welcome to this continuing report. Here we cover 1943 from the Grand Campaign from Dai Senso. You may notice way up in the north, the Japanese have just swept through Russia so quickly. There are two remaining Russian strategic VP hexes way out in the top left, being defended by about 5 steps of Russian infantry. They do have a headquarters up there, but the Japanese just have had numerical superiority throughout this. There were some brief delays around sort of northern Mongolia here and Lake Baikal, but the Russians couldn't hold out very long. The Japanese, as I said, just have numerical superiority. They are on the offensive, so they're picking their targets, and there's not a lot the Russians can do to slow them down. So yeah, 2 more VP hexes out on the left there, and that will be it for Russia. The Japanese have secured those VP hexes out on the right. Now, throughout the year, the Americans built up a lot of their infantry forces in places like Johnson Island, Hawaiian Islands, Midway. They invaded the Marshall Islands first, secured Eniwetok and Ponape down here. They increased their garrison on Guam, and they were planning to attack Saipan just to the north. But towards the end of the year, they rolled 2 pretty lucky events. They drew, I think the event, behind me here, yeah, something like Allies support nationalists, Allies support resistance. It is this event here which removes an Axis colonial unit from a hex. Incidentally, the Japanese have been garrisoning a lot of these islands with Axis colonial units, and Iwo Jima in particular had 2 steps of colonial units. So the Western powers, the Americans, removed one of those colonial steps, and then on the very next turn they rolled exactly the same result. This is a pretty rare result to roll, but they rolled it again, which removed the other step, which really reduced the steps in Iwo Jima. Now the Japanese were able to send some more reinforcements over. In fact, I've forgotten to remove their troop convoy there. And then, the Americans attacking Iwo Jima, rolled an exchange. So the Japanese in Iwo Jima down to 1 step. The Americans on that beachhead there. You can see the Marines on top. I'm talking about this area here, just to be a bit clearer. So this had 2 steps of colonial infantry, some defenders. The Americans have established a beachhead and trying to capture it. If they capture Iwo Jima, they're within striking range of Japan. Elsewhere, the Japanese have spent much of 1942, 1943 building up the garrisons. You can see Truckee has 5 steps, 5 defensive steps. Saipan has 5 defensive steps. Elsewhere, I think it's around 3. Yeah, 3 here. And the Philippines was looking a bit weak, so they've just rushed some more reinforcements up in the far north, Apari. Britain remaining quiet. Now, of course, throughout here, there's this British Neutrality Pact, and not much happening with all those sort of cream-coloured British colonial Commonwealth forces. So with Russia, the Japanese continue their attacks on Russia. America kind of commencing their counterattack. Now, the big story here in the Pacific is what's happening off the board in these force pools in terms of the support units these 2 forces have. What I'm getting at here is that, the Western forces can't begin a counter-offensive. They can't begin to strike west through the Pacific until really they are at least on parity and ideally outnumber the Japanese in terms of those support units. They need surface fleets, CV fleets, and so forth. And by early to mid 1943, they finally reached that point where they had parity, if not superiority. It then comes down to a matter of timing and the Western powers using this superiority at the right time. Now, when they launched their attack on Iwo Jima, I removed those 2 Axis colonial forces. They launched this attack. They didn't quite have superiority. I think they were one short, which enabled the Japanese to get kind of favourable odds for that combat and force that exchange. But should it happen again, what we're now seeing, let me take you down to the turn track. So I'm at the end, that should all be out actually. I'm at the end of this turn, about to head into November, December 1943. You can see a lot of CV fleet, troop convoys and so forth coming out for the Allies, whereas the Axis are now experiencing greater delays in the delay box. So a lot of their forces are taking some time to come out. You can see the rising sun marker on plus 11. I haven't done a count yet for the next turn. It may push up to 12. So you count basically strategic value, where we were on here for several turns. It may be pushed up to here for VP. So a few more VP and the Japanese automatically win. Having said that, we're here. We've got about a year, almost 2 years of war left, and then it ends. And I don't know if the Allies can take back all those 12 VP. You may notice Japan is almost empty at the moment because the Japanese have been quite quickly rushing a lot of the forces that were defending Japan out to those southern islands in the Pacific. Now this is really the heart of the game, the heart of decision making and progress throughout the year. So let me run you through the card choices that have been made. The Japanese trying to get some blitz markers, haven't been using them very effectively. I think this one's the most effective, enabling them to capture a Russian city. It gives them some replacements, but really they're spoiled for replacements. They actually getting more replacements than they have, the Japanese. They tried rolling for some bombers and failed. They kept rolling on the Bushido table, which was largely inconsequential, so that was a bit disappointment. Then they made a critical decision to play material shortages. Now this does two things. It gives them an extra air force. It enables them to play subsequent cards, like the Ichigo offensive requires material shortages, but it penalises them with this material shortages marker, which gives them an extra delay, an extra month's delay for every unit returning to play. Now, because they had this victory point advantage and we basically had a negative modifier when they selected this, they thought it would be a good idea. Since playing this, the +1 for that, there's now a Western Forces sub-fleet, which adds another +1 delay modifier. And the US commitment level track has increased to 2, which adds another delay modifier. So these 3 delays for the Japanese all came at the same time. They were getting a negative delay modifier. Now it's up to a +1, I think. And then they played Ichigo offensive, didn't use the blitz marker. Again, largely for the prerequisite, I think, or just to get some more forces on the board. That's always a nice event. You may have noticed as well, they have influence Xinjiang up in the top left there. That probably won't be of great consequence. In the pre-war, you get a lot of these diplomatic events which influences nations. It starts to dwindle off in the limited war, and by total war, there's very little influencing happening. You may recall in the last video, 1942, the US were limited to a lot of their limited war events. Now you can see they're starting to bring out their total war events. They played Trident Conference. Now that USCL was at 1, they're allowed to play that. They followed that up, having that as a prerequisite. This also reduced the ESV value, which is important. I'll talk about that in a moment. They played Operation Cartwheel, which brought out a sub-fleet US Air Force. They had played Operation Cartwheel, so then they could play Operation Galvanic, which brings out a US fleet, surface fleet train convoy, which is huge. And at around this time, USCL2 was reached, and they could play Eureka Conference, which also reduces the ESV by 1, brings out more surface fleet. So you can see the US strategy here, meeting prerequisites and bringing out their support units. Whereas the Russians completely hamstrung. They're playing War Progress 3. They want the long war, and it's not happening. They can't afford, because of the ESV value, which I'll talk about, they can't play many cards. So they're stuck with these border defense cards, which keep coming out, and they're 1 War Progress card per year. Now let me show you the European War display and this ESV value. It's currently on 1, which is pretty good. It got up to 2, nearly got up to 3. This is dangerous for the Western forces and Russians. If it ever reaches 5, it's an Axis total victory. if the Russians play certain cards, it increases this value according to the value of the card, which you can see there, +2, +4, or +6. If they play a +4 right now, 1, 2, 3, 4, the Axis win. So the Russians, you've got to be careful. This can randomly increase or decrease based on certain events and die rolls. So yeah, it's a bit scary for the Allies. So the Americans, the Western forces, have been trying to play these cards that decrease the ESV value in the hope that the Russians can then play some cards to increase their production, but it's probably too late for now. So yes, the big story of 1943 has been, I guess, the shifting of attention, finally, from sort of mainland Asia to the Pacific and the greater involvement of the US. They are trying to attack, but the Japanese have just built up these good defensive positions. The Japanese have a lot of troop convoys. They're starting to lose the kind of surface fleet, CV fleet battle race. The Americans outnumber them here, but they still have so many convoys, and there's so much they can do with their convoys and their superiority of land forces. The Japanese just get so many replacements. You may have noticed this Hoku Ichimaka. I think I mentioned this last turn. It just brings out so many replacements for them. So every time they lose a unit, it comes straight back out. So yeah, the Japanese are just kind of like sitting back. Sometimes they're throwing away attacks against Russia because they know they'll get these forces back. So that is the end of 1943. We have a little less than 2 years left, but I think the writing is on the wall. I'm going to play this out, don't worry. But I think the Allies will very much struggle to make any dent in the strategic value differential and thus the victory point differential. All right, folks, I'll report back soon on 1944.